Thank you for joining us at the University of the West Indies Museum for our Innovators and Inventors series. So this is the first in our series that looks at the research output of the University of the West Indies, first in its initial form as UCWI, and then as the University of the West Indies. And the goal, think of this as a kind of outreach program. We're translating specialist data to make it accessible to the general public, and just to kind of think very tangibly for non-specialists and for the general public about what is the innovative research that the university does and how it creates a positive impact in the region. So today we're looking at this story, the Tropical Metabolism Research Unit, the TMRU story. And with me today I have two directors. The first West Indian director, Professor Emeritus David Picou. We have Professor Emeritus Anne Ashworth, and we have Professor Emeritus Michael Golden, who was also director 1985 to 1991, right? Professor Picou is one of our first West Indian. You were here, entered the UCWI in 1949, is it? Yes, in 1949. So remember, UCWI started in 1948, and Professor Picou joined the school campus in 1949, graduated in 1955, went and did his doctorate and came back to be director of the TMRU. And that's phenomenal because that speaks to the professionalization of West Indian nationals to then come and direct and lead research in the region. Professor Ashworth Hill is a nutritionist who studied in England and did a lot of her research, early research work at TMRU before going out. And Professor Golding was in Ireland, right? And then also came to the West Indies to do some work on nutrition, malnutrition more specific. And they're going to tell you more about it because I don't want to say too many wrong things. I'm trained as a historian, so I want to make sure I keep my content simple and accessible. Okay, so the first thing I would like our speakers to do, and starting with Professor Picou, how did you get into your specific area of research, and what were some of the kind of everyday things that you had to do? One of the things that you all mentioned to me in your early years was that you had to make everything by hand. And so one of the things I would like you to do is to kind of speak about that process. And we have photographs. Professor Golding was very kind to bring photographs from the 25th anniversary of TMRU, which they had on display objects that were created in the units. We're going to hand you the photographs as a way for you to kind of point out, and then we'll circulate them in the audience so that persons can also see what it is that you're talking about.
Thank you very much, Shanti, if I may call you that.
Shani, yes.
Right. I came to the TMRU, Tropical Metabolism Research Unit, in 1959, which is about 60 years ago. At the time, I was recruited by Professor John Waterlow, who was the first director of the unit. We were both at scientific meetings in Atlantic City. I was, at that time, I did a residency in pediatrics at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and then after 1 year, I was completely broke, and I was appointed as a research fellow at the Children's Hospital. And I did a couple of courses and so on. So Professor Waterlow asked me if I would come back to the West Indies to Jamaica to join the unit. The unit at that time, that was in 1959, yes, had lost its pediatrician. He had stayed 3 years and went back to England, and they were desperately in need of a pediatrician. And the fact that I was also interested in research made it more important as far as he's concerned. So I was offered a 1-year contract to come back to work at the unit. So that is how I came to be at the unit for 1 year, and I actually stayed on for 20 years and became a director at the unit.
So I too was recruited by Professor Waterlow, and at that time he was in London. Sometimes he would go to London to do work at St Mary's, and John Garrow would act here at TMRU in his absence. So I was recruited in 1964 as a scientific officer with the Medical Research Council overseas staff. I came to Jamaica in the middle of winter, very rough seas on the Jamaica Planter, and that had delivered bananas to Britain and was coming back with a cargo of Irish potatoes and 12 passengers. And I was one of them, and my equipment that I shall talk about was with me in the hold and my little Morris Minor.
Oh, I was an adult gastroenterologist in Belfast, and I had one particular patient with celiac disease was unresponsive. And for one reason or another, we started to parenterally feed this woman, and I looked up a paper by Retlands from Sweden, and it listed all these stupid trace elements and zinc and selenium and all the rest of it, which he'd been feeding pigs. So I went down to the pharmacy and asked the pharmacist to make up the same recipe to give to my patient with celiac disease intravenously. So it took him a few days to make it up because it kept precipitating out. And then we infused this into the patient, and it was the most fantastic Damascus moment I'd ever come across, because this patient was going to die, was unresponsive to everything we were doing, and suddenly her celiac disease got better. She developed a fantastic appetite, was taking 12,000 calories a day, and put on weight dramatically, so I resigned. I said, this is not in any textbook, I need to find out about this. So I flew to London to the MRC, and they weren't helpful at all. So I went to the Wellcome Trust and met a fellow called Selwyn Barker, who said, oh, there's a very odd fellow called Waterlow. Maybe he would be interested in you. So I just walked out of the Welcome building, and it was raining, and I walked in, and walked in and had an interview with John Waterlow. He said, have you not got a CV? I said, no. Have you not got any papers? I said, no. So I told him this story, and he said, yeah, we'll give you a job. So he kept me under interview for a year in London, which I hated, and then sent me out to Jamaica. And I too came out on the Nordland banana boat, 12 passengers, landed in Port Antonio, and I had an old battered Ford van, which I brought. And I thought it was going to be, I can go on for ages, I thought it was going to be very hot in Jamaica. So I sprayed the front seats white so that they wouldn't get hot, and the paint didn't dry. So when they unloaded the boat from onto the docks, a Jamaican drove it out so I could pick it up, and the back of his shirt and trousers were all white. And I didn't have any Jamaican currency, and I had to pay for a new set of clothes for this fella. So I had to give him pounds, and he was not very happy about that. So at any rate, then it was you who came and saw me, and I went and lived above Anne in the ERU flats. Yeah, she was in the ground floor, and I was with my wife and 2 children. Wilton Hill, which is a very eminent lawyer in Jamaica, was down below. And I was away one summer and came back, and the toilet had all dried out, and my son went to the toilet, but the cement had all cracked and everything came through the floor and covered Wilton Hill. Oh, I could tell lots of stories, story after story.
Yeah.
But the TMRU received me with open arms.
Okay, so we have footage of an interview with Sir John Waterlow from the 1980s that we're going to play. Just 2 minutes of it so you can know who it is that they're speaking about.
I was sent out here as a very young doctor, first in 1945, just at the end of the European War. During the war, as a result of submarine action, the Caribbean became very short of food, and there was a great deal of hunger and suffering, and many babies and children were dying for reasons that weren't completely clear. So my job was to look into this problem of the young children. And I was sent first to Trinidad, where I stayed for 3 months, then to Guyana, and finally to Jamaica. And in Jamaica, at the end of 1945, I had the very good fortune to meet the Irving Commission, and particularly the West Indian members of the group, Philip Sherlock, Hugh Springer, and Dr. Gervin. And I was so impressed by the plans they were making for a new university that I determined to come back here as soon as I possibly could. I had also, during my 9 months that I spent in the Caribbean at that time, been rather concerned at the racial differences which existed in the professional circles in which I moved, where people who had been West Indians, who had been trained in Britain, in Edinburgh, Dublin, and London, and so on, when they came back, were not really treated exactly as equals by the British doctors. And I felt that the university, which from the very beginning had this input of West Indians, was likely to break down these barriers. In 1945, I was determined to come back here. And in about, I suppose, 1947 or 8, posts began to be advertised. And I applied for the professorship of physiology and didn't get it, so I had to wait a bit longer. Then I happened to be sent to Rio de Janeiro to an FAO conference representing our government, and I asked to be allowed to return via Jamaica. That was about 1949. And I was met by the then principal, Sir Thomas Taylor, spent 3 days with him, and he said to me, why don't you come and be a part-time lecturer in physiology and a part-time member of the Medical Research Council staff, which was my substantive position. And I thought that was a very good compromise. And so that was arranged, and I came out here in 1950 in that capacity and started teaching in the Department of Physiology, doing my clinical research at Kingston Public Hospital.
Okay, and I mean, he goes on later to explain how he got the TMRU started, and we allow it to run after. So, okay, Sir John Waterlow obviously played a very instrumental role in bringing each of you, all of you, to this space to do this very important work on child malnutrition. Well, eventually becomes child malnutrition and child mortality for children under the age of 5. So for what I would like for you to do, now, I will just say this as a historian. Prior to World War II, infant and child mortality was a very fundamental problem in the colonial world, but especially in the West Indies. So we have figures for infant mortality in the hundreds. Antigua had 233 per 1,000 live births in 1920. Jamaica had 174 deaths per 1,000 live births. Guyana had 184 per 1,000 live births. So this was this was a fundamental problem leading up to World War II. And of course, this would have been aggravated by economic depressions, by political unrest, which we have in 1938, and then by the food shortages that were caused by World War II. So each of you, this unit comes at a very important point in the political development of the region, and also in terms of just the kind of well-being people development. So I want you, each of you, to kind of talk about those early years in terms of the work that you did, and then should kind of just speak specifically to equipment that you probably had to develop at this point, because we're also at a point where we don't have commercialized access to medical equipment.
I happened to be one of the students. As I said, I went in 49, and then he was teaching physiology. And at the end of the term, he invited all the students that he taught to his house. So I went along, and as you walked into the room, every third or fourth person was handed a bottle of rum. And he said, "That's yours for the night. Ice is in that bucket, and there are other sodas and so on over there, and enjoy yourself." So I found that was a tremendous gesture on his part. Of course, the party became rowdy and noisy after a couple of hours. Anyway, to come back to John Waterloo and instrumentation, he himself was a brilliant inventor of equipment that you could not find commercially. And some of the things you will see displayed, the actual instruments, like a micro balance that you could not find, that would measure or do the weight of liver biopsy samples that he would be doing from these children. And he had also developed what is called a Cartesian diver, which was 1,000 times more sensitive than the instruments that were available at that time. He also insisted, when any new member of staff came, that they make their own micropipette and calibrated his own micropipette. So he showed you how to do it, and he did it very quickly. He took a piece of glass with a flame and made a constriction in the glass and tapered the end, so you had a micropipette. Now it sounds very easy, but it's not that easy. But we all learned how to make our own micropipettes and calibrate them. And I kept mine for years, even when they were available commercially. I still use micropipette. And when I measured it, it took up exactly 58 microliters. And I was wanting one for 50, but I kept it right throughout, even when you were able to get the 50 microliters. So he was an inventive person, and he had a machine shop at the back of the unit with a lathe, and he wanted everybody to learn how, but that was impossible. Sorry. He had a machine shop at the end of the laboratory, and he wanted people to learn to use the lathe to make metal equipment and so on. But I never got the hang of it.
Thank you. So TMRU was my first job. I just finished my PhD, and Prof. Waterlow must have had very many requests to work here. So there was always something that must have just captured his imagination with the ones who actually came. I think in my favour was that I was a nutritionist and there wasn't one. Also, I'd been to Jamaica for the independence celebrations in '62. My job fairly soon after coming was to measure metabolic rates, energy expenditure, and I was really trying to find the energy cost of growth. And so I thought that if I measured the metabolic rate when a child came in and wasn't growing, and I measured it again when they were growing very quickly, I'd somehow be able to find the energy cost of growth. The difference in their intakes was enormous from coming in, and during rapid weight gain we could have intakes of 200 calories per kilo per day and rates of weight gain 20 times faster than a normal child of that age. So they would grow extremely quickly. And I thought I'd be able to capture this by measuring metabolic rates. And so I did this, resting metabolic rate at different rates of weight gain, and there was absolutely no difference. So then I thought, well, it must go somewhere. I mean, these huge intakes, it must go somewhere. And so I then started measuring the metabolic rate from whilst the child was resting 4 hours after the previous feed, and then the child was fed, still in my equipment, and then I measured the metabolic rate sequentially for 2 hours or 3 hours after the feed. And the effect was astonishing. We got huge rates of increases in the metabolic rate. And this was totally contrary to the classical theory of specific dynamic action, which said that the metabolic rate at most would increase only by 4%, 5%. And I was getting increases of 30%. It was unheard of. And we went on. I went on to plot the rate of weight gain and energy intake against the rise in metabolic rate after a meal, and it was the most beautiful linear line. I'm so proud. Yes, it's absolutely perfect. And so I thought, we must write this up and challenge the theory of specific dynamic action. Now, the unit at that time had a very good library. Journals came regularly. We used to get Nature every week, The Lancet every week, and I thought, where shall I publish? Well, I'll try for Nature. It was accepted, and at that time, I had no idea that Nature was even a prestigious journal. I was really very naive, and there we are, one of my first papers was in Nature, challenging the specific dynamic action, the classical theory. And then I thought, I must have even hit the jackpot here, because Sir Hans Krebs wrote to me about my paper. And I knew Krebs cycle. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is really, really nice. I've done something. Yes. So I think I can talk about my equipment, but maybe later.
Well, actually, let's talk a little bit about this equipment, because the paper actually looks at this specific equipment here, right? That's in this photograph, which we will circulate after so everybody can see. So what year is this?
This would be 67, 68.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So my equipment was made for me. And we were so lucky with the Medical Research Council. Do you know, I never applied for a grant for maybe 8 years at the unit. Money came. I mean, Professor Waterloo must have done a huge job behind the scenes, but we, as researchers, we never applied for grants. We had a good idea, and we did it. And if we needed money, that was done. Well, because the Medical Research Council knew that I was coming to Jamaica and would be measuring metabolic rates, a young inventor called Heinz Wolf made this equipment for me, and it's for measuring metabolic rates continuously. It could be for babies, and I did over 4 hours at a time, or for adults who could sleep in this ventilated hood all night and have their metabolic rate measured continuously. And the aim was that my equipment should be maintainable by me with no outside help whatsoever. And so there's a Perspex dome here on a wooden base, and there's a hose here, and that's where a flow of air is drawn over the baby's head by having a vacuum cleaner under the bed with a variac transformer, so you could adjust the flow rate. So you have air flowing over the baby's face and out at the back. And so then what we need is to know the volume of the expired air. Obviously, it's diluted expired air that we're collecting. We need to know the volume. So under the bed, there was a domestic gas meter. And we also needed to know the oxygen and CO2 composition of this diluted expired air. So there was a little aquarium pump at the exit from the back of the hood, which took a small sample continuously into a bag, a collection bag, which I could then take and analyze the CO2 with, an amazing bit of equipment, the Lloyd Haldane apparatus, and the oxygen with the Servomex oxygen analyzer. So that was the basic sort of principle of this. You had to get your sample of diluted expired air and analyze it. But there was also a worry of what would happen, say, in the night and there was a power cut. We didn't want our subjects to suffocate. So also on the back of the hood was a very noisy blower, which would come on if the pressure inside the hood started to increase, either because the outlet was blocked or there was a power cut and the vacuum cleaner was not working anymore. So it made a very big noise, so it would wake up the subject. I've gone on too long. Anyway, that was my equipment. And Heinz Wolf, this young man who worked at the bioengineering unit of the Medical Research Council at Hollyhill in North London, he made my equipment, And I used to work alongside him and know how to just do everything. And he went on to be Professor Heinz Wolff, an inventor who had a wonderful TV program, a BBC program called The Great Egg Race. And this was a sort of challenge for other inventors. They were given a task. It might be to carry an egg, across a whole lot of difficult things, and they had to find a solution. And it was a competition. Well, that was my inventor.
Yes, in comparison to my colleagues, I was a Johnny-come-lately. I didn't arrive till 1970, late 73, 74, early 74. But we were still having pipettes made and things like that. And I had to measure protein turnover with 15N glycine and run the old mass spec at that time. And Dave Puka was very happy because I took over running up there twice a day to put the dry ice into the trap of the mass spec. At any rate, then we had to collect urine from the children, and I had a sealing thing, commercial sealing thing for sealing polythene bags, and we used to make these kite-shaped polythene bags and then cut a hole in it and stick it over male genitalia with colostomy cement. And then we put tubes going into this bag, and the tubes were coming out, and there was again a aquarium pump, pumping air in and pumping air out of this thing. And whenever the child peed, the aquarium would suck up all the pee and put it into a trap, which was sitting on ice. But we wanted to get this pee really quite quickly before any bacteria would grow. So I then went down and was working with the people in the Department of Physics, and we got an old cuvette which we used in the analyzer, a quartz cuvette. And we attached this on, so we had the quartz cuvette, and we had light going through that. So whenever the child peed and the light came through the cuvette, it would cut this light beam. And it would then sound a buzzer. So as soon as the child started to pee, you see, and if this happened at night or I was in the unit, then we were called to collect the pee there and then and get it deep frozen and so on. And then we invented a whole series of bubblers going along to take out the ammonia and then take out the urea and add urea in and bring it over and collect it into Rittenberg tubes and analyze it in Dave Piku's favorite machine. Oh, and then we went on and started to do balance studies in the same way, but this time we stuck over the baby's anus with a colostomy cement. So when the baby had a stool, it would fill up the plastic bag. And this didn't work very well at the beginning because we found that the baby passed a lot of gas. So then the baby was sitting on this little cushion. So we had to put a prick. We had to put a prick in the end of the bag, and then you had to get to the stool before it sort of squeezed out this little prick hole in the thing. So, and then we freeze-dried that in a freeze-dryer and analysed it and so on. But there was really very accurate quantitative collection, immediate collection of urine and collection of stool. Just as it was passed, we were able to get it. And we didn't have a Anne Seekins, who hasn't been mentioned, and she was an extremely important member of staff at that time. And maybe, Dave, you can talk about Anne and what Anne Seekins was doing. At any rate, she had a gas chromatograph, but we never managed to analyze the stool gas that were coming out in this little bubble, which I always wanted to do. So if anyone has malnourished children and they can get some of this colonic gas, I think analysing that now would be enormously interesting. Now we have microbiome measurements and all the rest of it. What gas is coming out of these babies, I think, would be of extreme interest.
Professor Picou, so before you speak about Anne Seekins, could you tell us a little bit about the mass spectrometer, which is still in the TMRU? It's in a storeroom. Yes. Did I get the name right? I'm sorry.
Yes, mass spectrometer.
A mass spectrometer, right, which is still in the storeroom of the TMRU. But you told me a very interesting, you told me about the history of that piece of equipment. We don't have it here. It's too big to move here. But could you just speak a little bit about that before you speak about Anne Seekins?
Well, when I came, I found this piece of equipment called a mass spectrometer. And John Garrow, when I came to the unit, the equipment had just been bought and was sitting there. John Garrow said he didn't know how to use it, and I said, "Well, don't look at me because I just got here." And to cut a long story short, it was a very expensive piece of equipment. And John Waterloo decided, well, David, I think you must go and learn how to use this thing and to maintain it and so on. So I was sent to University of Birmingham, and I became a postgraduate student there to work with Dr. Wally Crane, who was an expert in mass spectrometry, and a very nice chap. He was from Australia originally, and we talked about cricket and so on, and I told him, I don't think that you could beat the West Indies again after they won one match. Anyway, he taught me all there was to learn about mass spectrometer. First of all, how you prepare samples in order to analyze a sample, and also how to maintain the equipment. Every night for years, I went to the unit to fill the chamber with dry ice to keep the instrument, part of the instrument, cold. Right? Religiously. Whether I was going to a party or coming back, I made sure that I stopped by and dropped dry ice in. Anyway, I learned from Wally Crane. I spent a year or so with him. At that time, I was also writing up my PhD thesis, and so I was pretty busy. I came back, went to the mass spectrometer, made sure that all the pumps were working, filled up with ice, went back later and started to work on it, and it worked beautifully. Same with the samples. I set up part of the lab to work on the samples in order to collect gas in a special tube for analysis. These tubes had to be absolutely spotlessly clean and had to go through a rigorous cleaning process because you were measuring nitrogen, and anything that may contain nitrogen, any contaminant will ruin the experiment. So these tubes had to be meticulously clean before they're used. And once we got a hang of it, it worked beautifully. And I spent many years working on that instrument. And I don't know if Alan is in here. Alan Jackson, who succeeded me, he came to work with me, and he also learned how to use the mass spectrometer.
So Alan Jackson is in these photographs, in this photograph here on the ward, which is a very, I thought this was such a beautiful photograph, because what Sir John Waterlow did was to lobby that the TMRU had a ward as well as labs.
Yes.
Because at the time there was no designated proper lab to do the kind. I think he said that his lab was in the Gibraltar Flats or something like that. I can't remember from the interview. But there was no proper lab. And so by lobbying the MRC as well as the governor at the time, he was able to use some kind of fandangling system to get the stuff done. Yes.
Yeah, no, the unit was special in that the ward was attached to the unit. And the ward had all the children in it. They had a metabolic kitchen and so on. But how were the nurses going to be? Who's going to pay for the nurses? That was a problem. So eventually, the hospital provided most of the nurses, and the MRC would pay for 2 research nurses as part of the running costs of the thing. So that worked out fine. And the unit had the ward had a section for adults, which we didn't use because as babies we were treating. And one day I got a call, and the professor of psychiatry, Professor Boburn, came to me and he said, "David, I have a proposal I'll make to you. I am doing a study on chronic marijuana smokers, and I need to admit them for 2 nights because I was doing a series of tests on lung function and so on, etc., etc. But I can't get any space on the other wards. Nobody wanted to have them. Would you be able to accommodate? They're going to be marijuana smokers and controls." So I said, well, on one condition, that you will sign a paper saying that I am not responsible for the behavior of these people, and also I need to have special protection. I spoke to the sister on the ward before I made any promises to Professor Boburn. And nurses were afraid that at night, so on. So I made sure that there would be guard 24 hours for these subjects. So it was agreed, and you did not know who was a marijuana smoker and who was not. Until one day, the sister came to me and said, "No, Doc, I know who is smoking and who not smoking." One day, the sister came to me and she said, "Yes, I know who's smoking and who not smoking." So I said, "How do you know?" "Well, you see, the ganja smokers, they will come, help feed the babies, play with the babies, right, and look after them and so on. Perfect. The others never came near the babies. So, anyway, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be talking about now.
You're talking about exactly what you're supposed to be talking about. Okay, so at the conference in your presentations yesterday, and it was part of Professor Ashworth's presentation, you spoke about the outreach which was done to Lucy Hospital, which was one of the first kind of outreach elements to kind of institute treatment for malnutrition. The TMRU is known to create the manual that informs the WHO's policy on treatment for child malnutrition globally. So I want for you to kind of speak about that process, that community, moving from the ward into going out into the community to begin educating nurses about how to treat child malnutrition.
Yes, so one of the things that Professor Waterlow did was to set up the Nutrition Advisory Council, which was a multi-sectoral committee to advise the government. And one of the things he wanted to do was to collect all the information in Jamaica that was relevant to nutrition. And he gave me the job of finding this out. And at that time, for example, there were no data, no mortality data. So it meant going to every hospital and looking at their registers, looking at admissions and deaths, and working out, what were the most common reasons for coming to hospital. It was diarrhea and respiratory infections was what we found. And also I looked at malnutrition deaths. I also did things to do with school feeding, agriculture, food balance sheets, everything, imports, exports, everything that had any sort of link with nutrition, I collected those data. And so early on in collecting the hospital data, I went to the hospital in Montego Bay, which at that time was a little wooden place right by the beach. And the nurse in charge said she would show me around, and I thought that was very nice. And these little scraps looked as though they were new admissions. And I said to her, how long have they been here? And she said, oh, this one's 6 months, this one's 4 months. And it became apparent that I said, well, what are you feeding? And she said, Castellan, which is a high protein, a concentrate basically. So there was no energy for these children to grow with. And then from there, I went to Lucy Hospital, and that's where we found the mortalities of 50%. So I did this. It was quite pleasant going to these hospitals on cruising around Lucy, and I did this with the family. They would go and play on the beach. I would go to the hospital and collect the data. And the Lucy one, this was on a Sunday, and I came back, and at the unit we had Monday meetings, and I said, you know, I found 50% mortality in Lucy Hospital. Now, the unit, we published a lot, and I think we had the idea that because we published our findings in the Lancet and so on, and if you went to an international meeting, you'd say, oh, yes, Dr. Ashworth, how lovely, I know your work, blah, blah, blah. But in fact, the information didn't get out to the rural hospitals. They never got the Lancet. They never got any information. So they didn't know. And so I came back and said to the rest of the group, I said, we really have to do something. And so Dave and I went back to Lucy, and started to speak, with the nurses there, and that's really where I picked up yesterday. So there's a little backstory to finding those high mortalities, and from there, we developed the manual for. It was malnutrition and gastroenteritis, and we did that in association with the Department of Pediatrics. CFNI published it, and that's the one that we really started with. That was 1973, thereabouts. And so that was the beginning of our Caribbean manual. And then Dave for the 1981 WHO guideline.
Okay, so just to kind of wrap up for that story, because you said that there was 50% mortality within the Lucy Hospital. So once you convinced the nurses to implement the procedure, what did the mortality come down to?
Well, even just with the feeding guidelines, it halved to 25% very quickly. And I mean, you need to show that something works to get the motivation. It's very important that the nurses are motivated and with you. And then you can start to build on the other things that were wrong. For example, there was a very high rate of giving intravenous fluids, which is what we don't want in severe malnutrition. So there were other things that we could build on. And then when, gradually with the Ministry of Health having nutrition officers, they were the ones then that started monitoring and helping and supporting, arranging for supplies if needed, and so it built up, and it was capacity building on a number of fronts.
Professor Golding, so in your own presentation yesterday, you were talking about what some of the key issues. The kind of like the application to dealing with issues of child malnutrition in conflict zones today. And so I was hoping just to kind of show. So one of the things, I'll just say for the audience, and some of you may know, that one of the things that's very important about the guidelines that were developed at TMRU Jamaica is that those guidelines were published by WHO in 1981, but then continued to be worked upon over time. But there were also issues about outreach, getting the information out, and having it being applied in hospitals in Africa and Asia and so on. But in Professor Golding's presentation yesterday, he spoke about the issues around conflict zones and how that also affects treatment of malnutrition. And I know that Jamaica is no longer an issue in terms of child malnutrition in the same way, but in terms of your TMRU experience and then your later experience, how do you see the experience, how has your approach then rather to responding to child malnutrition changed over the years in terms of today?
Well, again, I'm on Johnny come lately. I mean, what Alice told you about Lucy Hospital in 1970, I see every day in Africa as I go around. And I've been, I think it's 54 different countries. And when I reach a country, I do several things. It's nearly always I go and deal with the Minister of Health and the Permanent Secretary, and then we get the professors of the university and all, and we do a teaching workshop and so on. But before this, I insist on doing an evaluation. And we go around 4 or 5 hospitals and health centres within the country, and I'm finding exactly the same as Anne was finding in Lucy 50 years ago. In nearly every country we deal with. It's just the same. In fact, we found that the university hospitals are the worst. If you look at mortality, the university hospital is the worst, and then the district hospital, and then the country hospital. And the people that are looking after malnourished children in tents in the bush get the lowest mortality, which is clearly wrong. There's some desperately thing. In fact, Maputo University Hospital in Mozambique had a 70% mortality within the emergency room within the first 24 hours. And so the pediatric ward was only dealing with the survivor cohort from the emergency ward. And almost the same in Djibouti as well, and several other countries. So the other thing I always do, not only that, I've learned from Sally McGregor and other people. It mightn't seem so, but I do take your messages, you know. I always get a social worker and say, look, I'm not interested in going to forest parks or, you know, looking at lemurs or elephants. I want to go to the poor area. And the social worker always brings us into the slum areas, and we go and we sit in houses, and we see how they cook and see how they sleep and who's there and so on. And it is really shocking. You always end up with flea bites and lice and worms and frequently malaria and this type of thing. In Philippines was the one place that really shocked me, because they'd taken over the cemetery and they pulled all the bodies out of these crypts, and all the families were living in the crypts. The rich people had built the crypts to keep the bodies in, and you could see the bodies just lying on the ground, because as soon as the funeral was over, they would pull the bodies out and they would move into the crypt. And then there was a whole lot of places in the walls where you would stick the coffin. And it was like looking at a honeycomb on a beehive. And then we went in the evening, we went back to find out what was happening in the evening and how they ate. And they were all slipping into these beehive things where the coffins had been. And the coffins were all taken out, they were broken up and used as firewood, and the corpses were thrown in the rubbish. So all sorts of things like that. In Burundi, we had a really nasty experience, because the soldiers from the local camp were coming down and raping the mothers during the night. It was curfew. So I took it in my own... Stupidly, I took, a Wild West sort of approach, and went up to the army camp and started to complain to the officer in charge. And that's fine. And I went back to Bujumbura and was in the house. The next morning, 3 of the ladies had been shot in the head and their bodies thrown in the latrines. And it was clear, Professor Golden, don't come and complain about my soldiers.
Okay.
So you find these types of experience almost in all these countries. If anyone goes to Sierra Leone, they speak perfect Jamaican patois. Absolutely. Liberian patois is slightly different. Sierra Leone's patois is exactly the same as Jamaican patois, and you can sit there and talk to the patients, and they will answer in Jamaican patois and so on. Take really good histories, which none of the wee French and English poor children and staff can do. Sorry, I'm not talking about TMRU now, but I should talk about TMRU because we had the whole body counter, which the 4-pi whole body counter, which was the first one, which Dave was involved with, and we had engineers in. I saw yesterday one of the big photo multiplier tubes up there from the 4-pi whole body counter, and John Garrow was using that, and Chamberlain was using that. And then all the muscle biopsies which were done, and I took all those data, and then I took the balance data for trace elements and things, and that's what I used to design F-75 and F-100.
Right. Okay, so this is and you have to tell the audience what it is.
These are the modern diets which WHO agreed, but that came out of literally 20, 25 years of TMRU biological work by not just me, but by Anne and Dave and all the staff. But what I did is synthesize it all together with my own data, and then develop these diets. Right. But now I've learned from the community people here that when I go to Africa, I spend most of my time in the community.
Right.
If I may, I just want to say hello to my great friend Sir Roy Auger in the audience, and his daughter Simone is in the back there. While I was away, Anne was talking about
Lucy Hospital.
the hospital in Lucy.
Yeah.
Well, let me just give a little background to that. When I was working in casualty at the University Hospital in Kingston, in Mona, the registrar at that time in surgery and I got quite friendly and so on. And when I went out to Lucy, the registrar was a well-known Jamaican, and that is Dr. Arthur Wint, the famous sprinter, the Jamaican who won Olympic gold medal. I think it was in 200 or 400 or both maybe. So when I went out there, I saw Arthur Wint, and Arthur was adamant. He did not believe that we knew how to treat these children. There's nothing to train. He said, David, we'll treat them and send them home, and a few weeks later they come back the same way. I said, Arthur, do me a favor. Let us choose one of the patients, right? Or you choose it, and we will show you what we can do with that patient. And we chose one. We applied the regime that we had developed at TMRU, showed the nurses how to feed the child, how to make the feeds up, how often, and so on. And that child recovered and grew fat. And he was convinced now that this is the way to treat malnourished children. And he agreed to take part in this study.
Okay, go ahead, Prof.
No, I was just saying, Mike was given a description about how urine was collected and so on. And we had on the unit, just joined on the unit, Sally McGregor, who should have been here at this meeting, but for some reason or other, she wasn't able to appear. But Sally felt that this was a torture for the children, the way we collected urine samples. And there was an ongoing battle over the way these children were held down and so on. Eventually, there was a way found where the children were able to collect urine accurately and completely without having them tortured, as you would put it. I think, I don't know, Julie and Suzanne, who worked with Sally, they probably know the whole story.
So I want to leave a little time for question and answer. So I just want to just come to some final thoughts. In the discussion, and the unit had a discussion with some outgoing directors where they identified people in photographs and identified objects. But one of the things that Professor Alan Jackson said was that and it struck me, was that you save children's lives by getting the basic things right, the simple things right. And he told me that the more equipment you have, the more little gizmos you have, the less effective treatment is, because you treat what the gizmos tell you but not the whole person. And one of the things that has struck me from listening to each of you here and earlier in the week and yesterday, that the work of pediatrics and the work of treating child malnutrition and ill children generally is really more about care, right? Not just the science of treatment, but also a basic love and compassion for your fellow human beings. So in closing, I would like each of you to just kind of, what would be, if you were advising researchers and doctors today about tackling some of the key elements in children's health and in adult health, or as care providers, what word would you leave, or what sentence would you leave now?
I think it comes from respect. The thing ever Rasta will say to you, enough respect. But you've really got to believe that. You've got to respect that mother, and that mother loves her child and is struggling for her child. I used to go to Haiti every year to help there for 6 weeks or so. And you're always struck by particular patients. I had one mother who carried a 8-year-old child on her back for 16 miles over mountains because she'd heard that there was a doctor in this hospital who might be able to help her child. And I thought to myself, this mother really loves her child in an extraordinary way. And then I came back to the TMRU, and we had some students from Texas A&M came down, and we were doing a ward round, and one of the students made the remark, looking at the child, that mother couldn't love the child. I got so angry. I threw the student out and said, never come into a hospital ward again. You go and become a pathologist and chop them up. And that to me is the basis. You have a poor person who's struggling and living with animals and fleas and rice, and she's no food. The only thing she can do is do maybe a bit of teething. That's just income redistribution, and cook up some rice and peas and feed again, or cornmeal porridge again and again and again. And she is struggling. She's doing her best. She's just as good as we are, I think you've also got to believe quite strongly that we're all equal in the sight of God and not in the sight of man. And you've got to go back to your basic beliefs and say, yes, this person is equal in the sight of God and also in the sight of me. And then you've got to love your patients. And when I say love your patients, you've got to love them. You pick them up and you hug them and you play with them and you carry them around. And the one that doesn't make eye contact, the one that is just like this, Parkinsonian face, emotionless, that's the one you pick up, not the one that asks to be picked up. And that's the one you hug and you love and you kiss. And that is part of the treatment. If you don't do that, the child won't get better. I am so keen to say that medicine is not looking at test results from sending off blood to get a multi-channel analyzer and a CAT scan and an MRI scan, and you make all your thing, and then you put the most horrible, painful drugs into their bottoms, and then you laugh at it. I see so many nurses, and they take this, nasty drug, a cephalosporin or something. Ah! And everybody laughs. Why the hell do they laugh at hurting a child? I think we've got to get right back down to the original basic medicine of using your hands as an instrument to make the diagnosis, using your brain but at the bottom of it all, you've got to love children, love your patients, and go out of your way to do the best for them. And respect. Enough respect, enough respect, enough respect. The Rastas have it right.
Yes, so doing simple things well is exactly that, and also to pay attention to detail as part of that. Sometimes people will say that the guidelines don't work, but actually if you go and watch, they are skipping important things. And it is so important to do things well. And I think that also means that nurses have to understand why they're doing that thing. So, for example, a severely malnourished child often has diarrhea, so that's messy. They have poor appetite, so that's frustrating. They are crying and fretful and not happy, and that can be a disappointing environment for a nurse to work within. But if you are able to tell them that the reason why they're having the diarrhea is due to maybe not having zinc, or that if they are not wanting to eat is because they've got an infection that you may not know they have. And if you can give reasons why they should be doing the things that they're doing, I think that helps a lot for the nurses to understand. I'll just give you one example. So where we were working in South Africa is a former black homeland, the Transkei. And one of the things I noticed was that at 6 o'clock in the evening, the records for pulse respiration were completed already right up to 6 o'clock the next morning. So things were done in advance. And it was explained to me by one of the nurses. She said, "But it's freedom time now. You know, this was, we've ended apartheid." It was as if it was an imposition that had been put on them without really understanding that you do this as a means of taking a decision. And so once I think that they can see that there's a reason behind all the actions, that then they will be more careful.
That happens everywhere. I see pulse respiration filled up, and all the diet fully taken, filled up till the next morning. The reason is the nurses don't want to be cursed at by the doctors for not doing their job properly. It means when you admit a child, there's one nurse for 20 patients at night, and during the day there's 12 nurses. It means that the malnourished child in most hospitals in Africa, certainly, they get Rolls-Royce treatment, or at least their Chauveau treatment during 12 hours, and they get nothing for the other 12 hours. So in fact, they're only getting half the dietary intake you'd expect them to get. They're getting half the drugs they were expecting to get. Because this poor little nurse, one nurse and 20 patients she has to look after, she can't do it. So it's one of the reasons why the hospital management with very poor staff actually has a very high mortality rate. It's why all these children are dying at night and so on. Sorry, I'm...
Exactly.
It's just a couple of things I wanted to say. One is that when I came onto the ward, I couldn't understand why these children were dying, although we'd be treating them and so on. And as I said in my talk earlier, that I was convinced that we were responsible for their demise. And the one thing that I changed was the diet that they were getting when they were seriously malnourished, and how often they were fed, and the composition of the food that we were giving them. Something was going wrong, and when that was changed, there was a dramatic change in the children that started to recover on what would have been a very poor diet. And that really made me think that you can't go on repeating the same thing and getting the same result. And you want to get a different result. You have to do something different, and you have to look and exactly. And if it says to you, what you're doing is killing these children, then you have to go back and think. And that is why these children have been able to recover. That's one thing. The second thing is what Mike and Ann have said, and that is we were concentrating on the physical recovery of these children. And we were not giving enough, we didn't give any thought to the mental and psychological recovery that must take place at the same time. And John Wardlow himself wrote that this was neglected, and it's only when Sally and her group came on the ward and made it their business to tell us the psychological improvement of these children is just as important, if not more important, than the physical recovery that you're doing. That's the second thing. And finally, I want to say how important I think this series is, which you have done. And this is the first event in Innovators and Inventors series to showcase, collect, and record the work of scholars and activists who have shaped the research agenda and output of the university. I think that is a remarkable and event that you all are taking place in, and I am very happy indeed that I will be part of the original one in the series.
Thank you so much, Professor Picot. I want to end by saying the TMRU ward was closed in 2017. Was it 2017? Because there were no more patients to treat. And so I think that is probably the most important part of the work that was done by the scholars. Oh.
Yeah, I would like to acknowledge the people within the Ministry of Health in this respect. I think the Ministry of Health were absolutely remarkable in Jamaica in appointing Peter Figueroa and Diane Ashley onto their staff. And we haven't heard about Peter Figueroa or Diane Ashley at all during this thing, but they were absolutely critical. And I'll tell you why they were critical, because they were able to get bilateral funds, government-to-government funds. They were able to say to UN and UNICEF, no, we don't want to do that in Jamaica. The literature says this is what we should be doing. TMRU says this is what we should be doing. And they had direct access to the budget and to the government. And they were almost, in many times, subcontracting the university to collect the data for them. And then it was coming back, the answers were coming back to the Ministry of Health, and because Peter Figueroa and Diane Ashley were directly there, they were able to go straight to the budget, go straight to the minister and say, please implement that. We've heard so much about non-implementation here, and the reason we had implementation in Jamaica was not because of the university, it was not because of TMRU, it was because of Peter Figueroa and Diane Ashley. And I really want that to be recorded, please, and put into the archives of this whole meeting.
Okay.
I just want, as I sit here, and I look across and see this photograph, and that is me in the dining room in Gibraltar Hall. There.
Yeah. All right, I want to thank you all for coming and staying, and I'll leave you to, if you have time, you can speak to our panelists directly. And please walk around and look in the museum, and thank you for coming.